A lot has already been said about the state of Lord of the Rings Gollum at launch. The bugs, the performance issues, the erratic camera and controls, and I'm sad to say it's all true. Now on its latest patch 1.3, I'm finally able to test PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S versions today. Now, I gave it a little extra time to turn its troubles around, but let me tell you, even fully updated, I haven't played a game in such a dire state for a tech review. At least not since Shadow of Mordor way back in 2014 on PlayStation 3, which set a truly high bar for poor ports. Anyway, back to Gollum. It's flawed in some pretty fundamental ways, and not just the frame rate. The game design is almost taken straight from the dark ages of PlayStation 2 movie license tie-ins, an era, if you'll remember, where movie franchises were often turned into 3D platformers, riddled with awkward controls, a disastrous camera, and in the worst cases, bugs, and more bugs. Gollum is almost like a callback to that era, and with that in mind, when the game costs £50 or $60 at launch on the PlayStation or Xbox stores, or more if you want the special edition extras, there's really no excuse for it. Before we kick off, a few quick points. Development on Gollum started in 2019 on the Unreal Engine by Daedalic Entertainment, and it's clearly been a torturous road to release for the team too. Gollum has some interesting ideas on paper, a mixture of stealth, 3D platforming, plus a good versus evil judgment system. For the stealth sections, you use shadows, the bushes to crawl past enemy orcs, and in the platforming bits you navigate caves by clambering up walls, often with mundane tasks like pillaging ID tags from dead orcs. The biggest problem though, it's really the visual design. The game language for just how to navigate its world is often quite lacking. The opening cave area, for example, is dark, murky, and undefined to such an extent that it's often too difficult to see where to go next. Is that a climbable wall? Should I jump to it? Or will I go plummeting to my doom? It takes some real trial and error to find out, and even with an Arkham Asylum style alternative view included, which gives a kind of breadcrumb trail activated by pressing the L1 button, Gollum doesn't always make it clear where to go next. The big questions then, just how does Gollum look on PS5, Xbox Series X and S, bearing in mind each has graphics options to play with, including a ray tracing mode on PS5 and Series X? Secondly, how does the game's frame rate hold up on each? Does it hit its 60fps targets on any of these modes, or does it fall drastically short? Next, does the Series S version run at least well enough to hit its lower 30fps target? And lastly, what of the game's overall polish? And how greatly does Gollum's bugs detract from the experience at launch? Let's find out.
Why are they doing this to us? Smeagol has promised he'll find the precious for him.
Booting the game up on PS5 to start, surprisingly we're greeted by 3 modes, and all of this applies to Xbox Series X as well. Performance mode is selected by default, but we also have a quality mode, and lastly, a quality ray tracing mode, which is missing on Series S. And to cut to the chase, all modes run with the same core visual settings, all target 60fps too, with the key difference being the resolution target and of course, whether ray tracing features are enabled. On performance mode, for example, Gollum runs with a 1440p target on PS5 and Series X, but uses dynamic resolution scaling, DRS, to drop the pixel count to around 1080p. Next along is the quality mode, which instead runs at a fixed 1440p with no dynamic scaling. So, this lock at 1440p inevitably results in a hit to frame rate, but boosts image quality. And lastly, of course, on the far right is quality with ray tracing, which appears to engage DRS again. The target on PS5 and Series X is 1440p once again, but with the lowest pixel count coming in at 2240 by 1260. Jumping over to the Xbox Series S version briefly, we get 2 modes here, performance and quality, meaning we lose the ray tracing support. Otherwise though, Series S is surprisingly a feature match for the other consoles, even down to the resolution. We get a dynamic 1440p on its performance mode, again going down to 1080p lowest, and then a fixed 1440p on the quality mode, just like PS5 and Series X. The catch being, well, it's that gameplay is instead capped at 30 frames per second on Series S regardless of mode. Yes, even the performance mode is 30fps capped. So in a three-way split between PS5, Series X and S, there really isn't much between them on their respective quality modes. The biggest difference, of course, is the much lower frame rate on Series S here, and I've got to say, even 30 FPS is a struggle for the machine, which we'll get to. So what's up with the ray tracing mode on PlayStation 5 and Series X? Well, the team at Daedalic includes two forms of ray tracing on PC for reference, with ray trace shadows and ray trace reflections, but on console here it's currently limited to just reflections. In this case, RT reflections are only selectively applied to the level too. Around Gollum's cave, for example, there's a crisp mirror image on water bodies, puddles, waterlogged interiors, and it genuinely looks superb on PS5 and Series X. This opening cave area is a great showcase for ray tracing with its dewy wet surfaces. The drawback being, well, it's clear most puddles across the level aren't ray traced, and instead revert to a screen space or cube map method. So it's a mixed result. Where ray tracing does appear, the results are incredible, even if you pay a performance penalty for it, which we'll get to later. There's an extra twist to this ray tracing mode. Before the latest patch 1.3, and in fact before Gollum's release on Thursday 25th of May, I captured the game on patch 1.1 on PS5. Now, this build was what many journalists had access to for review, and honestly, Gollum's frame rate was significantly worse back then on PS5 than what it actually launched with. So here we see Gollum on its older patch 1.1 running as low as 15 FPS in this cave section, and this is the reason. The quality ray tracing mode on patch 1.1 ran with ray trace shadows as well, just like PC, giving Gollum's shadows a pitch black depth as he crawls in these moonlit patches. Plus, you'll notice he gets self-shadowing too. Before launch, these ray trace shadows were easily the most standout visual flourish on console. On top of this, on patch 1.1, we also had enhanced water shaders, adding a kind of diffuse layer to ray trace reflections. In other words, the quality ray tracing mode gave us ray trace shadows, while ray trace reflections put more detailed puddles at Gollum's feet. Clearly though, PS5 paid the price for running this mode on the original 1.1 patch, and its frame rate needed saving. Enter patch 1.3. On this launch window update, the game's frame rate is massively improved while using the same quality RT mode, especially so around Gollum's cave, which serves as a showcase of sorts for its ray tracing features, in shadows and reflections. Gone is the 15 to 20 FPS performance in this spot, and in its place we now have a more palatable 30 to 40 FPS range on the new patch. The cost, of course, being that those impressive ray trace shadows are removed, along with the advanced water shaders. Worse still, in the absence of ray trace shadows on PS5 and Series X, there are no shadows applied whatsoever on Gollum here. He goes completely unshaded in this lit spot. Even basic shadow maps aren't applied, creating a light, depthless result across his model. Thankfully, later areas beyond this cave still apply regular shadow maps, and again, this is a specific issue with areas dependent on RT shadows. In comparison with what we had previously, patch 1.3 does sadly strip out one of the best parts of Gollum's visual design then, but at least the frame rate is boosted beyond the sub 20 FPS we had originally. Speaking of removed features, there's another option that's been cut from console. Specifically, a toggle to enable hair physics on Gollum is removed outright from only PS5. The reason is pretty understandable too. On patch 1.1, before the game's official release, the game crashed repeatedly with hair physics enabled on PS5. In my case, it was about 10 crashes in the first 30 minutes of play, which is obviously just a write-off. The funny thing is, it's really just such a small extra detail, letting these damp clumps of hair on Gollum's scalp flap around. The option is still available on both Xbox Series X and S as of the latest update, and actually has a very minor performance impact overall. Before we get to the frame rate, let's talk on Gollum's bugs, because it has many even on the latest patch. Perhaps the most glaring issue, in fact, is on Xbox Series X and S, where both camera and animations suffer from additional judder, not seen on PS5. In particular, the camera motion, the camera travel distance, updates at uneven intervals on Xbox, creating this erratic, choppy result. It kicks in especially at low frame rates, and in extreme cases, like on Series S's quality mode for example, where drops under 20 FPS are pretty frequent, the camera no longer updates at typical intervals. The result being that panning motions become uneven, and even at 20 FPS it's pretty glaring. And likewise, the bug affects Gollum's jumping animations in a similar way. Any time the frame rate is low, like sub 30 FPS, rapid movements from Gollum update at almost half intervals as we strafe across this ledge. In practice, it makes the action practically impossible to track by eye. It's worth noting that as it stands, Xbox is behind the patch updates compared to PS5, but hopefully this one will be addressed quickly because it genuinely affects playability. Moving on, there are other issues. I've had gameplay load after a cutscene with no geometry or collision meshes loaded in, leading to Gollum just floating in space. Even after falling all the way to the bottom and reloading the last checkpoint, I actually couldn't escape this infinite loop of loading and falling. Eventually, I had to delete my PS5 save and start all over again, which isn't great. Next, there's the more superficial nitpicks, but still, textures and materials are of exceptionally low quality, and while cutscenes are well directed, the up-close details fall short of even last-gen PS4 or Xbox One standards. Textures appear low resolution, muddy, almost as if using a placeholder asset at points. We also have awkward NPC walking animations. We have broken collision detection, leading to Gollum floating over these jumpable partitions. I've had the controls simply stop responding altogether on Series S, leading me to quit out and start the game again. And I'm only scratching the surface here, but in short, Gollum needs a lot of work in tackling all of its bugs, and that's not even to speak on the frame rate. Speaking of performance, let's see the situation on PS5 and Xbox Series X to start. Each of course has 3 modes, and I've got to say the default performance mode runs reasonably well, based on the first 3 chapters on PS5 anyway. We're typically between 45 and 60 FPS, with the bulk of play at 60 FPS in the opening cave section. The worst drops on record are in pursuing the 2 orc guards right at the start, pushing us down to 45, or later on, emerging to the centre of the slave camp. For the most part though, PS5 is still in the upper end of the 50s or hitting the top 60 FPS line. It's also the most performant way to play Gollum on console, and based on the frame rate at least, PS5 is also a better pick than Series X overall, for reasons we'll get to. The biggest downside? That'll be the forced 30 FPS cap during cutscenes. Even on performance mode, the action caps at 30 FPS on PS5, and with uneven frame pacing adding additional judder to movement. Switching over to Xbox Series X, again on its own performance mode, we're looking at a less impressive range of 40 to 60 FPS. Also, Xbox Series X and S consoles suffer from additional streaming hitches, adding big frame time spikes not seen on PS5. So for example, just running through the opening missions, you'll get big frame time hitches down to below 100 milliseconds, sometimes a few in a row. It happens out of the blue, but especially in transitions to and from cutscenes. The good news is the actual frame rate on average is still pretty reasonable in the opening cave sections, typically in the 50 to 60 FPS region. However, in places where PS5 drops to 45 FPS at lowest, it's clear Series X suffers from even bigger performance issues. We go down to 40 FPS on approaching the center of the slave camp, for example, and later missions are much more variable on Series X overall. The state of this performance mode on PS5 and Series X shows the best case, so to speak. The cost being, the resolution drops to a range of 1080p to 1440p, and with no ray tracing extras. But what if we push the game to the quality mode on each console? What if we fixed the resolution to 1440p? Inevitably, the performance suffers. In fact, using this quality mode, just this opening run through the caves has it mostly fixed at the 40 FPS line on Xbox Series X, and switching to PS5, it's surprisingly a little worse still, at the high end of the 30s during the same run. It's not great, and for both consoles, this higher resolution quality mode tends to waver between 35 and 50 FPS. More glaring is the state of the cutscenes though. Rendered in-engine, these now run into the teens, at 17 FPS on PS5 for example. So all round, the quality mode is a very tough sell on both PS5 and Series X, given the sacrifice. Next along, of course, is the quality ray tracing mode. On console, we get RT reflections into the bargain, of course, and to be frank, the frame rate takes a corresponding hit. On PS5, the opening cave run plays at an even lower 30 to 35 FPS range, and likewise, Series X also runs at 35 FPS in this same section, down by 5 from the regular quality mode. Fortunately, the addition of DRS on both machines gives the renderer some flexibility here. Later levels, around the prison camp for example, tend to run better overall, and gets us closer to the max 60 FPS. There's a very limited use of ray tracing in these parts of the game too, and so it makes sense that with DRS engaged as well, we get closer to the performance mode's frame rates. On both PS5 and Series X, this mode makes for a very sluggish experience in parts. It's worth checking out, even if briefly, if mostly for the reflections where they appear. In general though, the performance mode is easily the better pick for playability. Last up, of course, is the state of Xbox Series S. It's a whole other ballgame for this one. Starting with the so-called performance mode, we're given a 30 FPS ceiling to all gameplay, rather than the unlocked 60 FPS on the other machines. Which on the surface seems like a pretty good idea, given Series S's more limited 4 teraflop spec, except it's not even consistently at 30 FPS here. Drops into the 20s are a regular occurrence, even with DRS engaged to adjust the pixel count. Plus, we of course get the streaming hitches of the Series X version into the bargain as well. Expect big lurches in frame times without obvious cause, disrupting the timing of a jump, and as for the cutscenes, even on performance mode, Series S is dropping well into the low 10s. It's very rough. There's really nothing performant about this mode, but I dread to think what other cuts to its visuals would be needed to bring it up to speed. Series S's quality mode next. Easily the worst way to play Gollum on current-gen consoles is on Series S using this higher fidelity option. I'm not sure why it's included, to be honest. At a fixed 1440p, the machine's barely capable of hitting 30 FPS, and it's much more so running at 20 to 25 through this whole opening cave section. Factor in the erratic camera and animation refresh bug on Series S, and anytime the frame rate drops under 30 FPS, which is most of the time here, the game is, at points, practically unplayable. All of Gollum's movement is simply out of sync with the frames being rendered, even at 20 FPS. In fact, even later sections don't improve as we work our way into the lava-filled mines or the prison camps. I'm all in favour of having more options usually, and in fairness, Series S does keep the hair physics toggle not available on PS5 right now. But as it stands, this mode is definitely one to avoid for Series S users. Overall, it's easy to count the failings of Lord of the Rings Gollum. The glaring lack of polish in its visuals at launch, the game-breaking bugs, the subpar performance, it's all very hard to overlook. Especially so given the high price tag of the game on the PlayStation and Xbox stores right now. I will say there are elements of Gollum that might interest Lord of the Rings fans, in that it fills in a blank chapter in the story between The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. Plus, the concept art included in the deluxe edition does give a fascinating insight into what could have been, into why there was excitement about the project in the first place back in 2019. But fundamentally, it hasn't landed as it should have. Even at a core gameplay level, there are problems here. Problems that even a patch update will struggle to solve, like the sheer tedium of its platforming and mission design. It's telling that the high point for Gollum, visually speaking, is seeing those ray traced shadows, a beautiful feature that, sadly, has been scrapped on PS5 and Series X, at least for the time being. And even with that removed, Gollum's performance on the most powerful consoles on the market still just isn't enough. Beyond patch 1.3, the forecast of yet more updates will be interesting to track at least, if mostly to see to what extent the developer is able to turn the game's fortunes around. In the meantime though, as a stealth game, Gollum is more worm eater than snake eater, and without a doubt one to avoid. But that's all from me. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.